Welcome to the Kyperian Commentary Podcast. This is episode 121, and I have the privilege of having Gabe Wrench, host of Cross Politic, here with me today. So I feel like I'm kind of pulling in the big guns. Gabe, thanks for joining me here.
Thanks for having me, Rick. Appreciate it, man.
Yeah, so what I wanted to talk to Gabe about is about a week ago on Twitter, he made a post regarding wine and communion, and it kind of took off. You were posting in response to sort of Kevin DeYoung's critique of the Moscow mood. And you said, the whole KDY thing got me thinking, how many churches disobey God's clear command and serve grape juice in communion to their people? And you're no stranger to controversy, obviously, but it kind of sparked off a little whirlwind, and you got the expected teetotalers who come in and say, no, grape juice is evil, or wine is evil and bad, grape juice is good. But surprisingly, I saw a lot of people from Reformed Presbyterian churches who wanted to engage and say, well, no, we know alcohol's not bad, but you shouldn't serve it in communion because, and they gave a host of reasons. So I wanted to talk to you about that. I know a lot of our folks who watch and listen are CREC guys, and I don't know of any CREC church that's a grape juice only church. So I wanted to just, especially for folks who are new, why do we do that? What's the deal with wine? And why do you believe God has commanded us to serve that in communion?
Yeah, it was, I was actually, whenever you tweet something, you never think it's that big of a deal. And then it becomes bigger than what you thought it was going to be.
Right.
And, part of my thinking there was, I was kind of thinking about just masculine theology in the church, because my response was to Kevin DeYoung kind of going after really our serrated edge, or our view of kind of the difficult rebukes you find in scripture from the prophets Paul and Jesus, and how we kind of use that here out of Moscow. And so that to me is more of like a masculine theology, more of a courageous theology when you're employing that kind of stuff. And so that got me thinking, where Kevin's against that. He serves grape juice in his church. He implemented government mandated COVID policies in the pews in his church. And to me, that's just the kind of the trifecta of kind of this broader evangelical world where it's very effeminate and there's no kick to it. And so there's a number of arguments for why we serve in the CREC, why we serve wine and communion. One is because Jesus said, do this in remembrance of him. And he was holding wine in his cup when he said, do this in remembrance of him. The phrase used there in the Gospels is the fruit of the vine. So it doesn't explicitly say wine, but the fruit of the vine, the Greek word for fruit is, product, is the product of the vine. And so, well, what's the product of the vine? Well, it's wine. That's what you work toward. That's what you crush the grapes for. That's the product of the vine. And so I think it's pretty explicit that Jesus was serving wine. And then you have kind of the aspect that you can't, grapes, when they're crushed, they just start to ferment. That's what they do. They don't, grape juice wasn't invented until 1860s. Thomas Welch invented grape juice in the 1860s. So there never was a time in historic Christendom where there was even access to grape juice. So we know that wine was always served. And then lastly, of course, Paul rebuked the Corinthians for getting drunk at the Lord's table in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and it wasn't grape juice. Paul didn't rebuke the Corinthians for serving wine. He rebuked them for getting drunk. So we know the admonishment was not against wine. It was against getting drunk with wine and everything. So that's just kind of the simple, the other, I think, symbolic reason why we serve grape juice or wine in communion and not grape juice is because, wine represents the gospel very well. Wine represents the blood of Jesus. Wine represents the kick of the gospel in our life and the kick of the gospel in culture, whereas grape juice kind of symbolizes, I think, really the broader effeminacy we find in evangelicalism, where there's no kick to grape juice. There's the symbolism of grape juice is very impotent, as opposed to wine. So those would be kind of three basic defenses of why we should serve wine. Now, I'll just add one caveat to this. Given our times, given where we're at, I believe we need to work towards exclusive wine and communion. I believe that.
Mhm.
But we have a lot of Christians religious scruples, or are kind of the weaker brethren in all this, and so we do have grape juice in the back tray. There's a table in our church where we have a tray of grape juice and a tray of uh, uh, um, bread without for those who are maybe allergic to bread or whatever.
Gluten stuff.
Yeah, gluten. There we go.
Yeah.
There's the word, the G word, the gluten word. So we do have a tray back there for both gluten-free bread and grape juice for those who either have religious scruples or are just allergic to the elements. And so I think that we're in a certain situation where it's like, I think it's fine to have that. I'm not against it. Grape juice does come from grapes. It's not the cake that Jesus had in his cup, but I think it's fine given the religious scruples. But a lot of this, what I don't think people realize. So I said that I think the rub that really got people fired up was where I said that it's effeminate for men to sit in the pews and let their pastors and their elders serve them this grape juice and not say anything about it. That's what I think. Connecting effeminacy to the men sitting in the pews, what really got people fired up. And I think any man who should know better and doesn't try to talk and communicate and try to address the immaturity of his own church is being effeminate. Now, of course, there's all sorts of men especially men in the congregation can do that really bad, be divisive, split the church, all that stuff. I tried to hedge against that in my article. People were still kind of coming after me for not saying that very clearly or not saying it good enough. But I said in my article, my blog post, I said, if you are new and you've come to the realization that wine should be served in communion, and you want to talk to your elders, leadership about it, make sure you give the same grace and patience and time that God gave you to come to those conclusions with your elders. So have real patience there. And so I hope I'm pushing back against the sin of being divisive in the article. At the same time, talking about men in a biblically literate congregation is you should know this, Rick. A biblically literate congregation is a blessing to you. It's a blessing to the leadership. And in no way should it be a threat to you. So if a man in your congregation comes and says, man, I've been reading the Bible, I think there's a conviction here that maybe our church needs to talk about, and that man's been in his word, he's been reading the Bible, well, you're going to receive that with like, oh, well, yeah, let's sit down and talk. We got a biblical literate congregation, and I respect that, and I want to hear this.
Right.
And so men that don't do that, I think, and they know better, James 4:17, they know better. They should step up and talk about it with their elders, and with all the grace and patience that God gave them as they went through that transition and that process.
Right. And Paul says in 1 Timothy 4 that Timothy is to devote himself to the study and teaching of the word so that his progress may be seen by all. So I think for a pastor to say, we have served grape juice in the past, but I'm being convinced otherwise by this man in my congregation or by anyone, by studying books. I think that's admirable because his growth is being seen by the congregation. I think sometimes you see the thing where a guy graduates seminary and never picks up a book again in his life, other than to do he does his sermon prep, and that's his book, that's his reading, and then he doesn't grow or change. And I think if you're that sort of person, a really biblically literate congregation can be intimidating or scary because they might outgrow you, and you don't want that. Not speaking to anyone particularly, but I think I have seen that happen in certain cases. But yeah, as far as the grape juice and the wine, we did that initially at our church 23 years ago when we started. We had grape juice and wine in the same tray. I think the grape juice was on the outside circle maybe or something like that, and that was kind of known because here in the shadow of Liberty University, we thought, I was a Liberty student. A lot of our guys were. We thought, well, we can't do that. And then over the years, as our church grew, we sort of quietly just switched over to all wine, and there was no hubbub about it at all. Surprisingly, there wasn't any pushback. And a couple people have come over the years who we've had a chance to talk to who have maybe had alcohol problems in the past. They've been drunks, they've sinned in that way. And a lot of people would say, well, you have to have grape juice for those guys. But in reality, it's opened up some great conversations. Let's talk about what's happened. Let's talk about whether this 5 milliliters of wine is going to cast you into an absolute drunken rampage or not. And if it is, what's the problem? So good stuff.
Well, and Paul's solution with the Corinthian church was not to, hey, you're getting drunk at the Lord's table. Let's find an alternative that doesn't have alcohol in it. That was not his approach. Right? His approach was, hey, you need to repent and mature. I mean, basically, people who are kind of trapped in the sin of drunkenness, the call to them is to repent, believe, and grow in the Lord. It's not to stay in this immature framework of how to view alcohol. And so the church for 1,800 years they had drunks throughout history in the church, and they always served wine for 1,800 years. What changed in the 19th century? And I point this out in my article, and I think this is actually the more egregious effeminacy that I pointed out in my article, is that the church for 1,800 years never served grape juice, only served exclusively alcohol, wine, and communion. And then the 19th century happened, which is in 1801, 1802, the temperance movement started, and it started within the church. A bunch of women started pushing, abstinence in the church, and then the church in like 1801, 1802, 1803, they started pushing vows of abstinence to alcohol in the church.
Right.
And so really the first part of the temperance movement started with kind of, let's say, call it first wave feminism, because that's what it was. And the church picked it up and started pushing abstinent vows in the pews. And then 1860 through 1870, Thomas Welch, he was a pastor, figured out that, hey, there's a business model here. And he's the one that figured out how to create grape juice without fermenting the grapes. And then his business model started in the church to serve churches and provide grape juice to churches who were, basically succumbed to the first wave feminist movement and the temperance movement. And so for 1,800 years, the church believed, wine, there's no debate. It's wine and communion. In fact, the only debate I think that really popped up was Luther was like, should we serve white wine or red wine? That was, I think, the only debate that really happened. And so all these modern views since the 19th century, all these modern views of grape juice in church and communion came from the first wave feminism temperance movement. And how feminine is that your theology came from a bunch of women trying to outlaw alcohol.
Right.
And you
trying to manipulate the men in their churches, right?
Through these abstinent vows and all this weird stuff.
Lips who've touched liquor will never touch mine. The sort of.
Well, that was Kevin DeYoung. Kevin DeYoung had a sermon where he said, I've never drank alcohol in my life. In fact, the most alcohol I've ever drank was at an Anglican church. In other words, communion. And so these guys are basing their view of wine and communion, a lot of them unknowingly, for sure, off the first wave feminist movement and the temperance movement in the 19th century. And then now we've reconstructed our theology around grape juice based off that shift. And so our view of communion, our theological view of communion, has been drastically impacted by the first wave feminist movement, temperance movement. And so the shift came from women, and men bit, and now we've reconstructed our theology based off the change of what happened in the 1800s. And we don't want to do. That's the world coming into the church. That's the world telling the church what acceptable theology should look like. And then now we've figured out the biblical arguments, or what we think are the biblical arguments, to be able to back up that change in the 19th century.
Right. And I think that's that integration of, this is the world's ideas about this, so we're going to shift to match it. I think that is a big point of difference in the two models, because I've read and enjoyed lots of Kevin DeYoung's books. He's a great scholar. I imagine if you were to sit down with him the two of you could look at the Synod of Dort and the Westminster Confession and the creeds, and you could check every box and agree on every point of doctrine. But there's something missing there that makes, dare we say, the Moscow mood a potent force that seems to be drawing a lot of people to it, versus the let's bend, let's sway, let's try to be acceptable to the world feel that the Gospel Coalition has. You still find good articles on the Gospel Coalition. You find a really lot of bad articles too, but it's really tempered by the don't be offensive, be winsome to the world mindset. So, yeah.
And I think that's just tied in. This goes back to the whole point where it's like the modern evangelical church has constructed its theology and tailored it more towards feminist sensibilities than towards biblical realities, and which is why we have grape juice in our church, which is why we resist kind of serrated edge theology, and it's why we're willing to submit to the government in areas where we should not submit. And that's the definition of effeminacy is men taking on women characteristics, so submission. Paul commands all men submit, but but when you submit and you should not, when you submit to authorities and you should not, you're being effeminate. You're being a coward. A man should not submit to authority when they're being tyrannical.
Right.
And when you do, you're being a coward. A man should, the other, I listed 3 examples of what it looks like for a man to be effeminate. One was submitting when he shouldn't submit. The other one was wearing women's clothing, Deuteronomy 22, verse 5. And the last one I can't remember right now. But so when men are living out submission in a ungodly way, that's being effeminate. It's taking good traits from a woman. It's taking biblical traits from a woman and a man taking on those traits. That's softness, the sin of softness in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 9 is also an example I listed from the Bible where men are being effeminate. And that softness is particularly related to homosexual relationship where the man was playing the woman or the man was playing the soft character in that relationship and everything.
Right. And I think the word there is malakoi, right? If I'm thinking correctly.
That's correct.
Which does refer to that, but it also extended morally to, a whole range of soft affectations where you have the man who's very emotional, who's very, he takes on effeminate characteristics when he speaks and does the lisp and, all of those sorts of things that you see
that's right
in our culture today. So, and a lot of pastors too kind of take that almost as a model, which is a problem. Yeah. Well, this is interesting because I brought you on here to talk about wine, and it looks like, what I thought was kind of a point of, let's discuss this for people curious about wine in our churches. It's connected to a lot more than just wine, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think that, and of course, when you're tweeting, you're limited on characters, and it's just tweets or tweets. They're an idea, and it was a broad stroke. I grant what I was doing was a very broad stroke, but I think that broad stroke works. I think we could all agree, generally speaking, that the broader evangelical church is effeminate. I think, broadly speaking, we could say that one of the major sins in the church right now is effeminacy and cowardiceness. So I was trying to get at the broader issue, but I think as I kind of thought through it, I'd already thought through some of the tweets. When you tweet it, you better do that.
Right.
But as I thought through it more, and I started seeing certain people that were responding to me, and I started thinking through, there's a correlation here. There's a triangulation of what's happening here. It's like those who obeyed government COVID tyranny and mandated it in their pews, those who reject serrated edge theology, and those who serve grape juice in communion. I was like, there really is, I think, a triangulation, a connection between all 3 of those things and what's going on. And then I'd say the big takeaway I really want people to see in all this, and I really tried to hit it hard in my article, was that our modern view of grape juice in communion was solely influenced by what happened in the 1800s and the temperance movement.
Right.
For 1800 years, we'd had none of that theology. We had none of this teetotaler grape juice theology in the church. And then a bunch of feminists, first wave feminists, came in and got the church to outlaw, wine in their pews by basically those abstinent vows. And then now these, 21st century pastors have now constructed their theology off what happened in the 1800s. And like I said, a lot of them probably don't even know it, but that should cause them to maybe reflect and really think through, why do all of a sudden I have this view of scriptures? Why do all of a sudden I have this view of wine or grape juice in communion? There should be some radical thinking there, or some radical maybe introspection, excuse me, on why I believe what I believe, when in the history of the church it never happened until the 1800s. I mean, I think those are the bigger issues on that. I have no problem everyone being wise and taking time, if you come to these convictions, to take your time to transition into wine and communion. Bring your congregation along, bring your people along.
Right.
But when Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me, that's a command. Go do this in remembrance of me. And granted, we're talking about wine and grape juice. We should take his command and want to do it the best we can. And there's weightier matters in the law, for sure. Like, homosexuality in our church is a way bigger deal. Homosexuality in our culture is a way bigger deal than wine and grape juice. But still, we should, if Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me, as good children of God, we should be like, okay, let's do it. And knowing that when you bring your church along, that you're just as patient with them as God was with you to come into these convictions. I don't want to make a bigger deal out of it than it is. I mean, I did create a big storm, and by saying making a bigger deal out of it than it is, I'm saying obviously there's major sins in the church that need to be addressed.
Right.
And this is, and the priority of what's going on in this world is lower. But I think what my tweet did reveal is that actually there's bigger sins and bigger thought processes and bigger issues connected to grape juice and this discussion on wine and communion. And that's what I think I exposed in all this.
Right. It's like the old joke about the guy who went to the doctor and he said, "Doctor, it hurts when I do this." And the doctor says, "Well, don't do that." Well, hold on. You should treat the cause of it. Why does it hurt when you poke this? Why, when you say don't drink grape juice, drink wine? Why is the reaction there? And it's other reasons. It's not just because of that. So I think that's very good point.
That's right. And you'll see like hardly all the people that were like, I mean, the tweets gotten hundreds of thousands of views, gone all over the place. Apparently it made it into the Baptist circles, the Presbyterian circles, the Lutheran circles. I had a Lutheran friend. He said, "Oh yeah, all the Lutherans are talking about it." And then the Catholic circles. And so it's a big issue. And I quipped in my article that I've been able to heal centuries of division in all these denominations and bring unity. And right. no one gave me credit for that and everything. But it's a bigger issue so small fights like this, or small quips like this, which is what it was, if it exposes a bigger issue, I think that's where the tweet is helpful.
Right.
And so I'm happy with the results. I'm grateful. It made me also think harder too about it, and that's why I wrote the blog post on it and everything. But I would say, of all the people that were against me and tweeting about it and everything, not one person has responded in a answerable way to my article, because I think that the connection to the theology shift in the 19th century is really unanswerable, and it reflects on them that their theology was built off the first wave feminist movement, and I think if they respond against my article, I guess I just don't know a good response to that connection and everything. And so I think a lot of people stayed away from actually responding to the article, which has been kind of interesting.
Right. Well, a lot of it was For me, as a Baptist going off to Liberty University initially, I didn't know anything about wine because we didn't drink wine. So it was always my assumption and sort of teaching that to turn a grape into wine, there's some special process that you have to do. And so you just don't do that. Like, why would we want to make wine? We just drink grape juice, right? And I still remember I was like a freshman in college when a Presbyterian friend of mine pointed out that actually, if you crush a grape, it turns into wine. There's no technology there. That's how God made grapes. And I think that was when I started questioning and thinking, hold on a minute then, because if that's the case, and again, until the 1860s, you couldn't have grape juice, at least long term, unless you had the guy standing at the table squeezing grapes into your cup. You didn't have grape juice. So I think that's a very good point. Well, Gabe, thank you for coming on. We're about out of time, but I really enjoyed getting to talk to you about this. I'm going to put a link to your article in the show notes. So those of you that are watching, you can go and you can read that. It's a really good blog post. So thanks for being here, Gabe, and taking time out of your schedule for us.
Thanks, Rick, for having me. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks a lot. You have a good one.